Our channel shares real stories, ones that our subscribers have lived through, experienced, or even ones that made the news. If you've lived through something like this, or if you know someone who has, feel free to leave it in the comments. For one mother, her life was never the same after the day her daughter disappeared. She remembers it as if it happened just yesterday. The moment she dropped off her daughter Isabel at a daycare center in a mall with the promise to get ice cream afterward. It seemed like any normal day, the kind where everything feels routine and predictable. But that afternoon would become the beginning of her worst nightmare. It wasn't a hard decision. She had been working all day, feeling exhausted, and Isabel, as usual, had begged her to go shopping together. She could see the excitement in her daughter's eyes, but she was tired and just needed to get some things done alone. "Not today, sweetheart," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "How about you stay here at the daycare and I'll be back in a bit. We'll get ice cream after I'm done, okay?" Isabel had been disappointed, but she reluctantly agreed, skipping off with a wave, her small figure disappearing into the daycare without a second glance. Her mother had watched her go, a mix of guilt and relief washing over her. Little did she know, that would be the last time she would see Isabel's bright smile. The hours passed and she went about her shopping, but something felt off. She couldn't explain it, just a nagging feeling in her chest, a sense that something wasn't right. When she returned to pick Isabel up, she was met with panic. The daycare was empty, the staff frantic, and the seconds stretched into an eternity. The silence was deafening, and in that silence she realized her worst fear had come true. Isabel was gone. In an instant, her world turned upside down, and she was thrown into a storm of chaos and uncertainty. The following weeks became a blur of endless questions, police investigations, and desperate searches. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. She had posters made, talked to anyone who would listen, and turned to the authorities for help. But despite the tireless effort, there was no sign of Isabel. The days felt like years, each one dragging by with no answers. She was left to wonder where her daughter was, what had happened to her, and if she would ever see her again. The pain of not knowing, of not having closure, became unbearable. And with each passing day, it seemed as though the hope of ever finding Isabel was slipping further away. The grief never really left her. It followed her, lurking in the background of every moment, and no matter how many days passed, she couldn't shake it. It was as though the world had kept moving, but she was stuck in time, frozen in that moment when Isabel had disappeared. 4 years had gone by, and yet the ache in her chest remained, deep and constant. Every day she woke up with the same weight pressing on her, the same questions haunting her. Had Isabel been taken somewhere far away? Was she safe? Happy? Or worse, was she still out there, lost and alone? Every night, she went to bed wondering if that would be the night she'd finally get answers. And every morning, she woke up to the harsh reality that no matter how much she searched, nothing changed. It was always the same. The posters she placed in every store, the endless calls, the inquiries to the police, it was all part of the same routine, and yet there was never any progress. The mall where Isabel had vanished had become a place she frequented often, not out of necessity, but because it felt like the last place she could still feel close to her. Angela had gotten used to the familiar faces, the security guards who stood at attention as if they too shared her pain. She had come to know them by name, and they too knew her story. Every time she passed by the daycare center, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened there. It wasn't just the loss of her daughter, it was the loss of her own peace, her own sense of safety. And as the years wore on, the signs of despair on her face became more visible to everyone around her. At 45, she looked much older, each wrinkle and crease telling the story of her grief. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She would go to the mall every few weeks to replace the worn posters of Isabel, to make sure that, no matter how much time had passed, the world hadn't forgotten about her daughter. And each time, she would look up at the pictures, her heart breaking all over again. One afternoon, after another long day at the mall, Angela decided to take a break. A friend of hers, Linda, had been suggesting for some time that she get away for a few days. It had been 4 years since Isabel's disappearance, and Angela's exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was starting to show. She hadn't taken a vacation, not even a weekend away in all that time. So when Linda offered a trip to Puerto Rico, Angela reluctantly agreed. Maybe, she thought, a change of scenery would help clear her mind, help her recharge enough to keep going with the search. When they arrived, the quiet beauty of the beach should have been a relief, but Angela couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. As they strolled along the sand, she tried to focus on the peaceful surroundings, but something kept tugging at her. She couldn't relax. Her eyes kept scanning the horizon as if she were waiting for something, anything, to give her the answers she'd been searching for all these years. It was then, as they neared a small cafe by the water, that Angela noticed something. In the distance, there was a section of the beach that had been cordoned off. She squinted against the sun, trying to make sense of the scene. It looked like a wedding was taking place. Angela wasn't one for gossip, but the elaborate setup caught her attention. There was something unsettling about it, though, something that made her pause. She felt an odd connection to the event, as if it were drawing her in. Linda, always the curious one, immediately struck up a conversation with a waiter at the cafe. Angela, however, found herself distracted. She kept looking back at the wedding, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the strange quiet that surrounded the event, or the way the guests seemed distant, not really interacting as most wedding guests would. Something about it didn't feel celebratory. It felt off. As they continued watching from the cafe, a thought began to form in Angela's mind, one that would send her spiraling into confusion and disbelief. There was something familiar about the scene. Something in the way the young girl walking down the aisle looked, something in her face. Angela didn't understand why, but a chill ran down her spine. The girl looked like Isabel. Angela tried to dismiss the thought, convincing herself that it was just the grief and exhaustion playing tricks on her. But as she looked at the young girl more closely, her heart skipped a beat. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't just the color of the girl's eyes, although they were the same aquamarine blue as Isabel's. It was the way she moved, the subtle expressions on her face. The longer Angela stared, the more she became convinced. This wasn't just a fleeting resemblance. It was her daughter, or at least someone who looked exactly like her. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. After all, 4 years had passed. Isabel could have changed, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Her thoughts raced. Was it possible that Isabel was somehow connected to this wedding? Had she been taken by someone here? The questions piled up in her mind, one after another. Angela's hands began to tremble as she stood up, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Linda noticed Angela's distress and looked over her shoulder, following her gaze. Linda turned back to her, her expression confused. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Angela couldn't explain it. She didn't know how to make sense of what she was feeling. All she could do was keep staring at the girl, her heart pounding in her chest. Linda, still not understanding the gravity of Angela's reaction, suggested they leave the area, but Angela couldn't. She had to know. Something inside her pushed her forward. It wasn't just the resemblance. It was a gut feeling, an instinct that told her something was terribly wrong. But the more she watched, the more uncomfortable she became. It wasn't just the girl's face. It was the entire atmosphere of the event. There was no excitement, no joy. It was too quiet. Even the guests seemed distant, almost robotic in their movements. The guards standing by the ceremony added to the unease. Something about their presence didn't seem right. Everything felt controlled. It didn't feel like a wedding at all. It felt like a carefully orchestrated scene, and the more Angela thought about it, the more it felt like Isabel was caught in the middle of it. Angela's mind was racing as she stood there, rooted to the spot. She had to know more. There was something she wasn't seeing, something important she was missing. The feeling in her gut told her she was so close to something, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She glanced at Linda, who was still standing a few feet away, but Linda's attention was elsewhere. Angela took a few steps closer to the event, her feet moving almost on their own, as if driven by some invisible force. The closer she got, the more unsettling the scene became. The young girl who had been standing at the altar was now moving around awkwardly, seemingly out of place. She wasn't interacting with anyone. Her movements were stiff, as if she were being controlled, and Angela couldn't help but notice the sadness in the girl's eyes that reminded her so much of Isabel's. At that moment, Angela felt a cold chill wash over her. She wasn't sure what she was seeing, but everything about the situation felt wrong. The more she observed, the more it seemed like the girl wasn't part of this wedding at all. She wasn't dressed like a bride. She was standing on the opposite side, not next to the elderly man, who seemed too old to be the groom. She looked trapped. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the girl. That face, those eyes, the way she moved. It was Isabel, or at least, it was a version of Isabel that Angela could never have imagined. She turned to Linda, her voice shaky. "I think that's her. I think that's my daughter." Linda, who had been looking at the event with a puzzled expression, suddenly froze. She looked at Angela, her face filling with confusion, then back at the girl. "No, it can't be. It's been 4 years, Angela. You're seeing things. It's probably just someone who looks like her." But Angela knew in her heart that it wasn't just a look-alike. There was something undeniable about the way she stood, the way she carried herself, that made Angela's heart ache with hope. She took a step forward, unable to stop herself. But before she could move any closer, the situation took a sudden turn. One of the guards at the ceremony noticed Angela and began to approach her. He looked stern, his presence making Angela's anxiety rise. "This is a private event," the guard said sharply, his eyes scanning her as if she didn't belong there. Angela felt her heart race. She had been caught, but the fear she felt wasn't from being reprimanded. It was the sudden, overwhelming certainty that something wasn't right, that the answers she'd been searching for were just beyond her reach, waiting to be uncovered. Angela stepped back, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. She knew she couldn't stay any longer, but the sight of the girl still haunted her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, torn between the need to confront the strange situation and the fear that she might be making a mistake, that perhaps she was letting her emotions cloud her judgment. She turned quickly, looking for Linda, who had already started to walk toward her, a look of concern on her face. "We need to leave, Angela," Linda said quietly, as if sensing her friend's distress. Angela nodded, though the confusion and fear were still boiling inside her. As they walked away from the beach, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something vital, something that would change everything. But what could she do with this gut feeling? She wasn't sure if she was imagining it, or if she was truly onto something. The doubts continued to eat at her. But the closer she got to the cafe, the more certain she became that she needed to get to the bottom of it. After a few minutes, they sat down at a table, and Angela struggled to focus on the conversation Linda was trying to have. But Angela's mind wasn't on the pleasant surroundings or the idea of a relaxing break anymore. She couldn't stop thinking about the girl, her face, her eyes. It was like Isabel had been transported into another life, another world, and Angela wasn't sure if she was ready to face the truth. But as Linda spoke, Angela's resolve started to harden. She knew she had to do something. The wedding, the strange behavior of the guests, the guards, it was all too surreal, too unsettling to just walk away from. She couldn't let go of the possibility that her daughter, or someone who looked exactly like her, was trapped in that life. The afternoon dragged on, but Angela's mind never left the beach. She finally stood up and told Linda she needed to go back. Linda looked puzzled, but Angela could see the concern in her eyes. "You're sure about this?" Linda asked gently, but Angela didn't answer. She just knew she had to go back. She had to get closer, find out more, no matter the risk. It was as if something inside her had snapped. There was no turning back now. As Angela made her way back toward the beach, her pulse quickened. The urgency she felt was hard to describe. Everything in her screamed that she had to see the girl again. that there was something crucial she was missing, something that could no longer be ignored. The beach had become quieter since her last visit, and the guards were less visible, but the atmosphere remained unsettling. The once elaborate wedding setup was now completely gone, as though it had vanished in an instant. The chairs were being packed up, the flowers removed, and the scene, which had once been full of life, was now marked by eerie silence. It was all happening too quickly. Angela's heart sank. She felt like she had missed her chance. Perhaps it had been nothing but her mind playing tricks, or maybe it was just a coincidence, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. As she stepped closer to the villa, she caught a glimpse through one of the windows. Her heart skipped a beat. There she was. The girl. She was inside, standing near the window, staring out into the distance. The resemblance to Isabel was undeniable. Angela froze. Her breath caught in her chest. The girl's face, the shape of her eyes, everything about her seemed like Isabel, but how could that be? She had to be imagining it. Yet, the longer Angela watched, the more it felt like this was no mistake. The girl, though not dressed in a wedding gown, had that same air about her. The connection was too strong to ignore. As Angela tried to make sense of the scene before her, she noticed the elderly man from the wedding standing nearby. The girl's body language was tense, stiff even, as if she were uncomfortable. When her gaze drifted toward the window, Angela felt a sharp rush of recognition, or perhaps fear, though she couldn't be certain. The moment of clarity Angela had longed for seemed within reach, but before she could process it, the girl was quickly pulled away, disappearing from sight. Angela stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes away from the villa. Everything she had been searching for was suddenly so close, yet she still didn't have the answers she desperately needed. She was left standing in the silence, filled with confusion and frustration, feeling as if she had finally touched the truth only for it to slip away. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her trance. The guards were coming, and Angela knew they would try to push her away, to stop her from finding what she had come so far to discover. But she couldn't leave. She had to find out more. There was no turning back now. As Angela stood there, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her. The feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger, and yet she wasn't sure how to proceed. The guards were getting closer, and the realization hit her hard. She might not have much time left. Despite the fear creeping up her spine, Angela took a deep breath and decided to move forward. She walked slowly toward the street, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. The sight of the girl in the window, the coldness of the event, the strange guards, all of it pointed to something more sinister. But what could she do? She wasn't a detective. She was just a mother, desperate to find her child. With each step, her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't just walk away and forget what she had seen. She had to get answers, even if it meant risking everything. The villa loomed before her, imposing and quiet, almost as if it were daring her to approach. Angela's gaze flicked to the security guards now patrolling the area. She could feel the tension rising, but there was no turning back. She had come this far, and there was no way she could walk away now. But as she neared the entrance to the property, she felt an odd shift in the air. The guards had become more alert, their eyes scanning the area as though they had been warned about her presence. She stopped in her tracks, realizing that she had overstayed her welcome. Every instinct told her to leave, but the need for answers, for closure, overpowered the fear that began to set in. She turned to look back one last time at the villa, her heart sinking as she realized the girl was gone. The place that had felt like a strange home for Isabel just moments ago was now empty. Angela's mind spun, unsure of what to do next. But then, as she turned to walk away, she noticed something that made her pause. The figure of a man appeared near the gate, his face familiar. William Langsworth. His presence sent a cold shiver through Angela's body, and she knew at that moment that everything she had feared was true. Angela's heart raced as she stood there, frozen, staring at the figure of William Langsworth. The recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. He was the one, the man who, in her gut, she had always known had something to do with Isabel's disappearance. She had seen him in news articles, heard rumors, but standing there face to face with him, everything felt more real, more terrifying than ever. Angela's instincts screamed at her to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. Every ounce of her being was screaming for her to confront him, to demand the truth. She knew the possibility was slim, but if she confronted him, would he confess? Or would she be walking into something even darker than she could imagine? He stood there, staring at her, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. Was it fear, guilt, or just annoyance? Angela couldn't tell. All she knew was that in that moment, everything she had feared was crashing down around her. He had been the one to take Isabel. She was certain of it. The fact that he was so close now, so tangible, made her pulse quicken. Every fiber of her being wanted to run at that moment, to pretend she had never seen him, but she couldn't. She had to know. She had to confront him. She had to find out if her daughter had been living under his roof, living in that villa all this time. And yet she also knew she was walking a fine line. What if she was wrong? What if it wasn't Isabel at all? What if confronting Langsworth led to nothing but more confusion and danger? But the answer to that question would not come by standing in silence. Slowly, Angela took a step forward, her body trembling with the weight of what was to come. Her voice caught in her throat as she prepared to face the man who held the key to everything she had been searching for. As Angela took that step forward, the weight of the moment settled over her like a heavy blanket. She knew there was no turning back. The air around her seemed thick with tension, and the silence between her and William Langsworth felt suffocating. He didn't move, but his eyes followed her every movement, his gaze cold and calculating. Angela's breath was shallow as she forced herself to speak, though the words were barely audible. She spoke about Isabel, about the girl she had seen at the wedding, the girl who looked like her daughter, and the years of pain and searching that had led her here. With every word, Angela felt a mix of anger, desperation, and determination surge within her. She had waited so long for this moment, and now, as she stood facing Langsworth, she couldn't afford to let fear or doubt control her. But Langsworth's response was chilling, as if her presence didn't faze him at all. In fact, he seemed almost amused. He dismissed her, belittled her, as though the pain she had endured meant nothing. Angela's heart pounded in her chest, the anger rising within her like a tidal wave. But as he turned to walk away, she saw something in his eyes, something in the way he carried himself. There was a shift, a flicker of hesitation that Angela caught in the briefest moment. It was then that everything clicked into place. Angela realized that the woman and the girl she had seen were not just part of some strange wedding event. They were part of his world, his twisted life, and Isabel had somehow been pulled into it. She had been living in that mansion, under his control, and now she was facing the truth of how far this man would go to hide his sins. With everything she had inside her, Angela knew what she had to do. She turned away, ready to face whatever came next. But she wasn't alone anymore. Isabel was out there somewhere, and no matter what it took, Angela would find her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in 4 years, Angela had hope. She was closer to finding Isabel than ever before, and that, more than anything, was what kept her going. Justice would come, and it would be for Isabel for all the years lost, and for the truth that had finally come to light.